Hello, my friend. Welcome to your sleep story. My name is James Calloway, and tonight it is my quiet honor to be the voice that carries you gently towards sleep. I want to tell you tonight about a wheel. Not a great wheel, not a famous wheel. A simple potter's wheel that once stood in a low stone workshop at the edge of a village in the south of France, in a place where the land is dry and pale and the lavender grows in long purple rows along the hillsides, and the light in summer is so clear and so golden that everything it touches looks as though it has been there forever. The wheel was made by a man named Henri Vidal in the autumn of 1921. He made it from oak and iron and a single heavy stone that he carried up from the riverbed himself in a wheelbarrow on a September morning when the mist was still on the water. This is a quiet story, a slow story, a story about the particular piece of making things with your hands in a warm room while the world outside goes about its business and asks nothing of you. It is made for you, entirely for you, to hold you as you sleep. But first, a few minutes of relaxation. Let's leave the day behind together. Relaxation. I'm going to count down from 10 to 1. And with each number, allow yourself to let go a little more. There is nothing required of you tonight. Nothing to finish, nothing to solve, nothing to carry. Just this. 10. Feel the surface beneath you, the bed, the pillow, the weight of the blanket across your body. Notice how completely you are supported. Every part of you, your head, your shoulders, your back, your legs. Held. You don't have to hold yourself up tonight. Everything is already held. And let the surface take your weight completely. Right now. Sink into it. Just a little more. 9. You are safe. I want you to really feel that tonight. Not just know it as a fact, but feel it moving through your body. From the top of your head, down through your chest, through your belly, through your legs, all the way to the soles of your feet. Safe, warm, held. Let my voice be a companion tonight. Not demanding anything, not going anywhere. Just here, in the quiet, walking with you towards sleep. 8. A slow breath in through the nose and out through the mouth. Easy, no forcing. Just a natural release, like setting something down that you've been carrying all day without noticing. Now scan your body. Your forehead, see if it can soften. Your jaw, let it fall just slightly open. Your shoulders, let them drop just a little. Your hands, unclench them if they're clenched. Your legs, let them be heavy. Wherever you find tension, don't fight it. Just notice it. Say hello to it. And then on the next breath out, let it go, like smoke rising from a candle. Up and away and goss. 7. The day is done. I know you know this, but let yourself really feel it. The day is finished. Whatever it held, the busy parts, the hard parts, the things left unfinished, the things you said, and the things you wish you'd said differently. All of it is behind you now, on the other side of this moment. Your thoughts may still be moving. That's fine. Thoughts don't stop on command, but you don't have to follow them. Let them move the way clouds move across a dark sky. There and then gone, and the sky behind them perfectly still. You are the sky, not the clouds. 6. This moment is yours, completely, entirely yours. No one needs anything from you right now. The night is quiet, the world is turning at its own slow pace. And you are here, resting, which is exactly and precisely what you should be doing. You have earned this, not just today, though you have, but simply because rest is what living things need. Rest is not a reward for a good day. Rest is a right. So take it fully. without apology, without the small voice that says there are other things to do. There are no other things. This is the thing. 5. There is a stillness inside you. There is always a stillness inside you, even when everything feels loud and full and busy. It lives in the space between your thoughts, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the warmth of the blanket against your skin. You don't have to travel far to find it. You only have to stop, and you're already stopping. You're already here. 4. Allow a little gratitude now, if you can, just quietly, for the warmth you have tonight, for your body, which has carried you through the whole of today without being asked, for anyone who loves you, for any small good thing, a good meal, a moment of light, a voice you are glad to hear. Hold it for a moment, just one breath. 3. Let your imagination begin to open now. Far from here, south, across the mountains, across the sea, there is a village in the south of France, where the lavender is long finished for the year, and the hillsides are pale, and the mornings are cool and bright. And at the edge of the village, on a narrow lane between two stone walls, there is a workshop, and inside the workshop, in the center of the floor, there is a wheel. Begin to see it. Begin to feel the warmth of that room. 2. Last check. Anywhere still holding, find it now. Breathe into it and let it go. Your body has worked hard today. Give it permission to stop. It knows how to rest. It has been resting your whole life faithfully. Every night, trust it. 1. Completely letting go now as I begin tonight's sleep story. The Sleep Story. Part 1. The village was called Saint-Cécile-des-Pins, which means Saint Cecilia of the Pines, and it sat in a shallow valley in the Var department of Provence, where the hills were covered with pine and oak scrub, and the stone was pale limestone that turned white in the midday sun and soft gold in the evening. It was not a large village, a square with a fountain, a church, a bakery, a bar with 4 tables outside, and a dog that slept under them regardless of the weather. A school, a post office, that was also the tabac. And along the narrow lanes that ran off the square like the arms of a starfish, the houses, low and thick-walled, with shuttered windows and small gardens, and the particular smell, in summer, of dry stone and lavender and the faint, sharp scent of the pines on the hillside above. Henri Vidal had been born in Saint-Cécile-des-Pins in 1887. He had grown up there, left at 18 to study in Marseille, returned at 22 to marry a woman named Colette, who had been born in the next valley and who had come to the village to visit her cousin and had, in the way these things happen, stayed. He was a potter. He had known this since he was a boy, since the afternoon his father had taken him to see an old man named Jourdain, who lived at the edge of the village and who made the simple earthenware that the village used. Bowls and jugs and plates and the tall narrow pots for olive oil. Henri had stood in the doorway of Jourdain's workshop and watched the old man at his wheel, the way the clay rose and opened under his hands, the way the walls of a vessel grew from nothing, and the way a thing that did not exist a moment ago began to exist. And something in him had gone very quiet and very certain. He had apprenticed to Jourdain at 15. He had worked beside him for 5 years, learning the clay and the fire and the particular patience that pottery requires. The patience of someone who knows that the work cannot be hurried, that the clay has its own time, that the kiln will do what the kiln will do and cannot be argued with. When Jourdan died in the spring of 1919, he left Henry the workshop. He left him the tools and the kiln and the stockpile of local clay that he had been digging from the same hillside for 40 years. He left him also the wheel, but the wheel was old, very old. It had been Jourdain's father's wheel, or perhaps his father's father's. Nobody was entirely sure. The wood was dark and soft in places, the iron fittings loose, the flywheel, the heavy stone disc at the bottom that gave the wheel its momentum, cracked along one edge and wobbling slightly on its spindle. Henri used it for 2 years, patching and tightening and compensating for its imperfections with the skill of someone who knew it well. But in the autumn of 1921, after a particularly long day in which the wobble of the flywheel had ruined 3 bones that he had otherwise been pleased with, he decided he would build a new wheel. He went to see Thomas the carpenter, who worked in a shed behind his house, on the lane that ran north out of the village toward the pines. They sat in Thomas's kitchen, and Henry explained what he needed. Not elaborate, just a wheel that was balanced and solid and would last. Thomas asked 2 questions. He said, "What wood?" Henry said, "Oak." Thomas said, "How heavy the flywheel?" Henry said, "As heavy as possible. I want the momentum to carry." Thomas wrote nothing down. Then Henry went to the river. The river ran along the bottom of the valley, shallow and clear over pale stones, lined with willows that trailed their fingers in the current. Henri walked along its bank for most of a morning, looking. He was looking for the right stone, a stone heavy enough to serve as the flywheel, flat enough and round enough to be shaped, without too many fractures or weaknesses in the grain. He found it in a bend of the river, where the current had slowed, and deposited a shelf of larger stones along the bank. It was a disk of grey limestone, almost perfectly circular, perhaps 2 feet across. It had been shaped by the river over. He did not know how long. A very long time. Long enough that its edges were smooth and its surfaces were worn to a faint shine. He stood and looked at it for a while. Then he got the wheelbarrow. He came back the next morning, early before the mist had lifted, and he levered the stone out of the river with a long branch and rolled it onto the wheelbarrow and pushed it back up the lane to the village. The stone was very heavy. The wheelbarrow wanted to go sideways on the steeper parts of the path. He went slowly. He delivered the stone to Thomas, who looked at it for a long time and ran his hands over it and said nothing, which was his way of saying that it would do. For the next 6 weeks, Thomas worked on the wheel in his shed. Henri came every few days to look at it, and they would stand together, and Henri would say what he thought, and Thomas would say very little, and then they would each go back to their work. The frame was oak, as Henri had wanted, heavy and close-grained, and with the particular solidity of old oak, the kind that seems not just strong, but settled, as though it has decided to be there and is not going to change its mind. Thomas fitted the spindle and the bearings and the head, the flat disc at the top where the clay would sit, with the precision of a man who understood that a wheel, like a clock, is only as good as its tolerances. He mounted the limestone flywheel at the bottom, balanced and true. On the last day of October, in the year 1921, he brought the wheel to Henri's workshop. It took both of them and Colette to get it through the low doorway and set it in the center of the room, where Henri had cleared a space for it. They set it on the flagstone floor, and Thomas knelt and checked the level and made one small adjustment to one of the feet and then stood up and stepped back. Henri sat down at the wheel. He set his foot on the kick pedal, the iron bar connected to the flywheel by a wooden rod, the mechanism by which the wheel was set spinning, and he gave it a slow kick. The flywheel turned, smooth and steady, the river stone carrying its momentum the way water carries a boat, effortlessly, for a long time after the initial push. Henry sat with his hands on the wheelhead and felt the vibration of it. Or rather, the absence of vibration, the smoothness, the trueness. He looked up at Thomas. Thomas said nothing. But there was something in his expression that in another man might have been satisfaction. Henry got up and went to the corner of the workshop where the clay was stored, covered with damp cloth, the way clay is always kept, cool and yielding. He brought a piece back, perhaps 2 pounds, and he sat down at the wheel again. He set the clay on the wheelhead. He wet his hands from the bowl of water beside him. He set his foot on the kick pedal, once, twice, and the wheel began to turn. He centered the clay. He felt it find its center under his hands. The particular moment when a mass of clay that is moving slightly off axis suddenly submits and runs true. It is a small thing, that moment. You would not notice it if you were watching from across the room, but in your hands it is unmistakable, a kind of settling, a kind of agreement between the clay and the wheel and the hands. Henri pressed his thumbs into the center of the clay and opened it. The walls rose. Outside, the October light was failing early. The pines on the hillside were dark against a pale sky. In the bar on the square, someone had lit the lamp. The dog under the tables was asleep. Inside the workshop, the wheel turned, and Henri Vidal, 34 years old, began to make something. That is the end of part 1. Rest here if you are ready, or stay with me, and I will continue. The wheel is turning. The clay is on the wheel. The workshop is warm. We will return to Henri in part 2.
Clara Wren had grown up watching her father work wood. He had been a carpenter in Harwick, a quiet man who spoke mostly in the language of planned edges and fitted joints and the smell of sawdust in a cold workshop. She had spent long hours as a girl sitting on the bench beside him, watching his hands, asking questions that he answered slowly and only when he had thought about them. She had learned from him, not everything, but enough. That winter, she built a chair. She didn't plan it carefully. She began it the way you begin something, when you have time and need, and the work of your hands to keep you sane. She started with the driftwood, heavy pieces of white oak that had come in on the November storms, bleached pale as bone by the sea, worn smooth as skin. Every evening, after Daniel was settled, and the light was tended, and the dishes were washed, she went to the shed. She brought a lamp. She brought her father's tools, which she'd packed in the bottom of the second trunk, without quite knowing why. She started with the legs, 4 of them, turned by hand, not perfectly, but well. She worked slowly. There was no rush. The winter was very long. She sang sometimes while she worked, old songs from Harwick, songs her mother had sung, songs from the church. The wood was hard and close-grained, and it did not give easily, but it was honest wood. It did what she asked of it, if she asked carefully. By December, she had the legs. By January, the seat, wide and slightly curved, shaped to hold a person the way cupped hands hold water. By February, the back, which she carved with small, careful patterns. Not pictures exactly, just shapes. The curve of a wave, the arc of a gull, a thin crescent that might have been the moon over the water. She did not know why she carved those things. They came from somewhere beneath thinking. On the last day of February, in the year 1890, she joined the last pieces, and she set the chair on the stone floor of the shed, and she looked at it. It was not a grand chair. It was not fancy, but it was solid and true and balanced, and the wood had a color to it now, something between silver and honey, that was entirely its own, and could not have come from any other wood or any other place. She carried it inside. She set it by the fire. She sat in it. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the February sea moved against the rocks in its slow, ancient way. The light was turning at the top of the lighthouse, sending its beam out across the dark water in slow, patient sweeps. Daniel called down from upstairs. He was better that evening. Some evenings, he was better. "What are you doing?" he called. "Sitting," she said. "In what?" "In something I made," she said. There was a pause. "Come up and tell me about it," he said. And she went upstairs, and she sat on the edge of his bed, and she told him about the chair. That was the beginning. The chair would stay in that lighthouse for the next 40 years. Clara tended the light, first alongside Daniel, then alone after he died, in the winter of 1901, then with her daughter Ruth, who was born on the island in the spring of 1891, and who grew up knowing the sound of the sea, the way other children know the sound of traffic or birdsong. Every evening, when the work was done, someone sat in the chair by the fire. In winter, with the stormlight dying early over the water, and the wind coming hard off the open Atlantic. In summer, with the windows open, and the smell of salt grass drifting through, and the long northern evenings going slowly golden before the dark. Clara sat in it and read. She sat in it and mended things. She sat in it and did nothing at all, which is also a kind of doing. Ruth sat in it as a child and as a girl and as a young woman. She sat in it the night before she left the island for the mainland, for a life that took her far away. She sat in it one last time when she came back to visit her mother, an old woman by then, and found her asleep in it by a low fire, her hands folded in her lap. Ptolemy III. There had always been a cat called Ptolemy, curled on the floor beside her. Clara Wren died in the lighthouse in the spring of 1929. She was 71 years old. She had kept the light for nearly 40 years. The chair stayed. The fire was burning low now in the grate. Outside, the sea was quiet tonight. That particular quiet it sometimes found in the deep hours before dawn, when even the waves seemed to be resting. The light still turned at the top of the lighthouse, out of habit, out of duty, its slow beam sweeping the dark water, touching the surface, and moving on. Inside the main room, the chair sat by the hearth. The wood had darkened with the years, 100 years of firelight and sea air, and the warmth of human hands. The carvings on the back, the wave, the gull, the thin crescent moon had softened with use, worn smooth by shoulders and backs, and the gentle, unconscious touching of people at rest. But they were still there. If you ran your fingers across the wood in the right light, you could still feel them. The chair was empty now, but it held, somehow, in the way that old things hold, something of all the evenings it had been sat in, something of all the people who had rested in it, the work that had gone into making it, the wood that had once stood in the sea, the woman who had planed it and shaped it and joined it in the long dark winter, singing to herself while the lighthouse turned. If you sat in it now, you might feel it. You might feel the back of it against your spine, solid, sure, the way good wood feels. You might feel the curve of the seat beneath you, shaped to hold you. You might smell something faintly if you were paying attention, something like the sea and something like wood smoke and something older than both. And you might feel in the way that tired people sometimes feel when they finally find exactly the right place to rest, that you are held, that the chair has you, that you can stop now, that you are safe. The fire crackled once, softly, in the grate. The light turned, the sea breathed, and in the lighthouse at Wren's Point, in the quiet of the long, deep night, everything was at rest. The chair stayed, but the lighthouse did not stay empty. In the spring of 1930, a year and a month after Clara Wren died, a man named Edmund Farrow arrived on Wren's Point with a single canvas bag, a wooden box of books, and a cormorant feather he had found on the dock at Harwich, and kept for no reason he could explain. He was 31 years old. He had been appointed keeper by the Lighthouse Board, which was a body of men in a building in Portland who had never been to Wren's Point, and who had, when they looked at the posting, noted only that it had been vacant for a year and required fill-in. Edmund had applied because he wanted quiet. He had been working for 5 years as a typesetter in a printing house in Boston. Good work, precise work he did not dislike. But the city had accumulated around him over those 5 years, like sediment, layer by layer, until he felt it as a weight he carried everywhere. The noise of it, the density of it, the way it demanded, constantly, that you be somewhere, doing something, moving toward something. He had seen the posting in a maritime gazette. He had written the letter the same evening. He came to the island on the supply boat that made the crossing once a fortnight. The boatman who brought him was a man named Price, taciturn and weathered, who said almost nothing on the crossing, and then, as he handed over the bag and the box at the dock, said, "She kept it well, the old woman. You'll find everything in order." Edmund said, "I'm sure I will." And he went up the stone path from the landing, past the gorse and the salt grass, to the lighthouse. It was exactly as Ruth had left it, the previous autumn, when she had come to close the house after her mother's death. The rooms were clean. The windows were tight. The lamp at the top had been wound and checked, and was ready to be lit that evening. On the kitchen shelf there was a note in Ruth's handwriting that listed, without comment, the practical things he needed to know: where the fuel was stored, the schedule for the supply boat, the name of the doctor on the mainland, the frequency of the fog signals. He read it, standing at the kitchen table. He folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box with his books. He stood in the main room. The chair was there by the fireplace, where it had always been. He had not been told about the chair. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, just a wooden chair, old and dark, set in the position of something that had occupied a particular place for a very long time. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went to deal with the practical things. That first evening, After he had lit the lamp and wound the mechanism and logged the first entry in the keeper's log, light operational, wind northwest, force 3, visibility good. He came back down the stairs to the main room, and he lit a fire in the grate. He made tea. He sat in the chair. It received him the way a chair receives a person when it has been receiving people for a very long time, without adjustment, without question. The seat curved under him. The back held him. The wood was warm from the fire. He sat for a long time, looking into the flames, not thinking about anything in particular. Outside, the Atlantic moved against the rocks in its slow, patient way. The beam swept the dark water. The wind came and went in the gorse. He thought, I could be content here. He was right. He was content there. For 12 years. Edmund Farrow was not a man who needed much. He needed the work, which was reliable and precise and satisfying in the way that necessary work always is. He needed the quiet. He needed his books, which were a varied and somewhat peculiar collection. Navigation manuals, Greek philosophy, the complete novels of Thomas Hardy, a history of the tides, a field guide to birds of the Northeast Atlantic, 3 volumes of Japanese poetry in translation, and a book about the geology of coastal Maine that he had found in a second-hand shop in Portland, and that he read and reread with the same pleasure each time. He needed, it turned out, the island itself, the particular quality of its light, the sound of the sea, which was never the same twice, and which he never stopped listening to, the birds, the gannets and guillemots, and the occasional puffin in summer, and in winter, the eiders and long-tailed ducks riding the swells, just off the rocks, with an equanimity he found genuinely inspiring. He kept meticulous logs, not just of the light, but of the weather, the birds, the state of the sea, the small events of the island's life. On a certain morning in November 1932, he noted, first snow of the season, light overnight, 7 snow buntings on the gorse, blown in on the northwest wind, sea running at 4 feet, confused. The chair, I notice, creaks slightly on cold mornings. Good company. He was not without visitors. The supply boat brought them occasionally. The inspector from the lighthouse board, who came once a year and found everything in perfect order, and seemed faintly puzzled that a young man of clear ability had chosen to spend his life on a rock in the ocean. A marine biologist one summer who was studying the tern colony on the eastern shore, and who camped for 3 weeks and came to supper twice. A journalist once who had written a piece about the lighthouse keepers of the Maine coast, and who asked Edmund whether he was lonely. Edmund had thought about it carefully. Not lonely, he said. Solitary. They're different things. The journalist had written it down. Edmund was never sure he understood the distinction. He read in the chair every evening. He had a particular method. He would finish the day's work, eat his supper, wash the dishes, wind the lamp for the night, and then sit in the chair with his book and read until he became sleepy. Then he would go to bed. It was a very good system. He slept well, always. The sea and the wind and the work took care of that. He read Hardy in the chair and Thucydides and the geology of coastal Maine for the 4th time, and the Japanese poets whose names he had learned to say properly over the years. He read in summer with the window open and the smell of the sea and the late light lasting till 10 o'clock. He read in winter with the fire built high and the storm pressing at the glass. and the light doing its work overhead. The chair held him through all of it. He was aware of this in a quiet way, not sentimentally, just practically, the way you become aware of a reliable thing over years of relying on it. He left the island in the spring of 1942. The war had reached even here. The Lighthouse Board had changed its procedures, increased its reporting requirements, and there were naval installations going up along the coast that changed the nature of the posting entirely. And Edmund had been contacted by a former colleague in Boston who was working on something he could not say much about, but which required people who were precise and reliable and could keep things in order. He packed his canvas bag and his wooden box, and he went. On his last evening on the island, he sat in the chair for a long time after the fire had gone down. The lamp was turning overhead. The sea was calm, which it sometimes was in May, a flat, dark mirror under a clear sky. He did not feel sad exactly. He was not a man given to melancholy, but he felt something. The weight of 12 years. The weight of the island with its particular light and its birds and its sound. The weight of the chair under him, solid and unchanged and completely indifferent to his leaving, which was somehow exactly right. He ran his fingers along the carving on the back. The wave, the gull, the thin crescent of the moon. He had wondered, over the years, about the woman who had made it. Ruth had mentioned her mother once, briefly, when she had come to close the house. She had said she made that chair herself in her first winter here. She said it the way you say something that you want someone else to know without knowing exactly why. Edmund had remembered it. He thought about it sometimes, working at the lamp or walking the shore. This woman, in a very cold winter, building a chair out of driftwood while her husband was ill upstairs and the sea was turning to glass outside. Building it not because she had to, but because she needed to do something with her hands. Because the winter was long and the work was steadying and the result would be useful. He thought that was a very good reason to make a thing. He stood up. He put on his coat. He picked up the bag and the box. At the door, he turned and looked back at the room one more time. The gray light of early morning coming through the window. The fireplace, cold now. The chair in its place by the hearth, unchanged. Right, he said quietly. To the room, to the chair, to whatever it was that a place accumulates over the years of people living in it. And then he went.
The next keeper was a man named Villanueva, who came from a fishing family in Gloucester, and who stayed 7 years and said very little, and kept the light with absolute reliability. After him, a young couple, the Hendersons, who brought 2 children and a dog, and who were the first people in 50 years to actually change anything about the main room, pushing the furniture around and adding a rag rug and a painted wooden shelf. But they kept the chair where it had always been. The children played around it, and the dog slept under it, and Mrs. Henderson sat in it in the evenings and wrote long letters to her sister on the mainland, and Mr. Henderson sat in it on his nights off and fell asleep with his chin on his chest, which was the lighthouse keeper's prerogative. After the Hendersons, the lighthouse was automated in 1968. The mechanism was updated, the lamp fitted with a new system that required no winding, no attendance, no keeper. A man from the board came out and made the changes
and left again on the afternoon boat. The lighthouse stood empty. The light turned. The beam swept the dark water, touching the surface and moving on, as it had always done, regardless of who was watching. But before the bored man left, and this was not in any report, and it was not officially sanctioned, but he was a man who had been in the lighthouse service for 30 years, and who understood, in some inarticulate way, what a place accumulates. He moved the chair back to exactly where it had always stood, by the fireplace, facing the room. He stood and looked at it for a moment. Then he locked the door and went down to the boat. The fire had burned down a long time ago. The room was quiet now, and dark and cold in the way that stone gets cold, steadily, deeply, as though the cold lives in the walls. Outside, the sea moved against the rocks. It had been moving against those rocks for a very long time, long before the lighthouse, long before any of them. It would be moving against them long after. The beam swept the darkness, and the chair sat in its place by the cold fireplace in the empty room, as it had sat for nearly 100 years. It was not waiting for anything. Old things don't wait. They simply remain. They hold in their grain and their weight and their particular worn smoothness something of everything that has passed through them. The winters, the fires, the hands, the voices, the long evenings of reading and thinking and doing nothing and being quietly, completely present in a place that asks nothing of you except that you be there. If you could sit in it now, and perhaps you can, in the way that the imagination can carry you to places your body hasn't been, you might feel that. You might feel the curve of it under you, the solid back, the warmth that seems to live in old wood even when there's no fire nearby. And you might feel, for a moment, that you are part of something long and patient, that the chair is holding not just you, but everyone who ever sat in it, and the woman who made it, and the winter she made it in, and the island, and the sea all around the island, and the dark sky above the sea, and the stars moving slowly through it. That you are held, that you can stop now, that you are safe. The beam swept the water. The sea breathed.
The chair stayed. The fire was low in the grate, just embers now, deep red, breathing slowly, the way a fire breathes when it has burned a long time and is finding its rest. The room was warm. The stone walls held the warmth, the way stone always does, slowly, steadily, without effort. The warmth had been in the walls all evening, taken from the fire, and now the fire was going down, and the walls were giving it back, quietly, into the room. The chair sat by the hearth. The wood was dark from all the years of firelight, dark and smooth and very still. The carvings on the back, the wave, the gull, the thin crescent of the moon, were soft in the low light, barely visible, just the faintest suggestion of shapes in the grain. Outside, the sea was moving. It was always moving. Even on the quietest nights, when the wind had dropped and the surface of the water was flat and dark as a stone, the sea was moving underneath. A deep, slow movement, the breathing of something very large and very old, turning in its sleep. The rocks at the base of the lighthouse received it. They had been receiving it for a very long time. Each wave came in, low and slow, tonight, barely a wave at all, more like a long exhale, and spread itself across the granite, and pulled back again, and then another, and then another. The sound of it came through the thick stone walls as something barely there, a low, rhythmic
presence. Not a sound, so much as a feeling. The feeling of something moving, steadily, without hurry, without end. The light was turning at the top of the lighthouse. It turned the way it always turned, slowly, patiently. The beam went out across the dark water and touched the surface and moved on. Touched and moved on. Touched and moved on. There was no one watching it tonight. There was no ship that needed it tonight. But it turned anyway, because that was what it did. Because some things continue, not because they are needed in this particular moment, but because continuity is itself a kind of faithfulness. The chair sat by the hearth. The embers breathed. The room was quiet. If you had come in from the cold tonight, up the stone path from the landing, past the gorse that bent and straightened in the sea wind, through the heavy door, you would have felt the warmth of the room first, before you saw anything, just the warmth coming out to meet you. And then your eyes would have adjusted, and you would have seen the low red glow of the embers in the grate, and the chair beside it, in its place, where it had always been. You would have taken off your coat. You would have set it on the hook by the door, the old iron hook that had held 100 coats over 100 winters. You would have crossed the stone floor, cool and smooth under your feet, if you had taken off your boots, which you would have, by the door, and you would have sat down in the chair, and the chair would have received you. That is the only word for it. Received. The way a harbor receives a boat that has been out on the water, without fuss, without ceremony, just opening and holding and being exactly what was needed. The seat curved slightly under your weight. It had been curved that way for a very long time, shaped by years of people sitting in exactly this way, in exactly this chair, by exactly this fire. The back was solid against your spine. The arms, low and smooth, were there if you wanted them, not demanding anything. You would have let your breath out. You might not have realized until that moment how much you had been holding. The cold outside, the wind, the crossing, the day before the crossing, and the day before that, and all the days that accumulate without your noticing until you sit down somewhere that is completely, utterly still. The fire breathed. You breathed. The embers were very low now, just the deepest ones, still holding their color. A deep red-orange, almost amber, pulsing slowly with the faint movement of air in the chimney. Not enough to give real light, just enough to know the fire was still there. The room had settled into a particular kind of dark. Not the dark of a place with no light at all, but the dark of a place where the light has gone down gradually over hours, so that your eyes have followed it all the way and adjusted at every step. And now you can see, faintly, softly, the shapes of things, the chair, the hearth, the window, with the darkness of the sea beyond it, and the slow sweep of the beam moving across it every few seconds. The window was thick glass, old glass, with the slight waviness that old glass has, that makes whatever you see through it seem just slightly softened, just slightly dreamlike. The rocks below, the dark water, the beam touching it and moving on. Everything outside was cold, but the room was warm, and the chair was warm from the fire, from the evening, from the particular warmth that lives in old wood that has been sat in for 100 years.
The chair stayed. The fire was low in the grate, just embers now, deep red, breathing slowly,
the way a fire breathes when it has burned a long time and is finding its rest. The room was warm. The stone walls held the warmth the way stone always does, slowly, steadily, without effort. The warmth had been in the walls all evening, taken from the fire, and now the fire was going down, and the walls were giving it back, quietly, into the room. The chair sat by the hearth. The wood was dark from all the years of firelight, dark and smooth and very still. The carvings on the back, the wave, the gull, the thin crescent of the moon, were soft in the low light, barely visible, just the faintest suggestion of shapes in the grain. Outside, the sea was moving. It was always moving. Even on the quietest nights, when the wind had dropped and the surface of the water was flat and dark as a stone, the sea was moving underneath. A deep, slow movement, the breathing of something very large and very old, turning in its sleep. The rocks at the base of the lighthouse received it. They had been receiving it for a very long time. Each wave came in, low and slow tonight, barely a wave at all, more like a long exhale, and spread itself across the granite, and pulled back again, and then another, and then another. The sound of it came through the thick stone walls as something barely there, a low, rhythmic presence. Not a sound so much as a feeling, the feeling of something moving, steadily, without hurry, without end. The light was turning at the top of the lighthouse. It turned the way it always turned, slowly, patiently. The beam went out across the dark water and touched the surface and moved on, touched and moved on, touched and moved on. There was no one watching it tonight. There was no ship that needed it tonight. But it turned anyway, because that was what it did. Because some things continue, not because they are needed in this particular moment, but because continuity is itself a kind of faithfulness. The chair sat by the hearth. The embers breathed. The room was quiet. If you had come in from the cold tonight, up the stone path from the landing, past the gorse that bent and straightened in the sea wind, through the heavy door, you would have felt the warmth of the room first, before you saw anything, just the warmth coming out to meet you. And then your eyes would have adjusted, and you would have seen the low red glow of the embers in the grate, and the chair beside it, in its place, where it had always been. You would have taken off your coat. You would have set it on the hook by the door, the old iron hook that had held 100 coats over 100 winters. You would have crossed the stone floor, cool and smooth under your feet, if you had taken off your boots, which you would have, by the door, and you would have sat down in the chair, and the chair would have received you. That is the only word for it, received. The way a harbor receives a boat that has been out on the water, without fuss, without ceremony, just opening and holding and being exactly what was needed. The seat curved slightly under your weight. It had been curved that way for a very long time, shaped by years of people sitting in exactly this way, in exactly this chair, by exactly this fire. The back was solid against your spine. The arms, low and smooth, were there if you wanted them, not demanding anything. You would have let your breath out. You might not have realized until that moment how much you had been holding. The cold outside, the wind, the crossing, the day before the crossing, and the day before that, and all the days that accumulate without your noticing until you sit down somewhere that is completely, utterly still. The fire breathed, you breathed. The embers were very low now, just the deepest ones, still holding their color. a deep red-orange, almost amber, pulsing slowly with the faint movement of air in the chimney. Not enough to give real light, just enough to know the fire was still there. The room had settled into a particular kind of dark. Not the dark of a place with no light at all, but the dark of a place where the light has gone down gradually over hours, so that your eyes have followed it all the way and adjusted at every step, and now you can see, faintly, softly, the shapes of things, the chair, the hearth, the window, with the darkness of the sea beyond it, and the slow sweep of the beam moving across it every few seconds. The window was thick glass, old glass, with the slight waviness that old glass has, that makes whatever you see through it seem just slightly softened, just slightly dreamlike. The rocks below, the dark water, the beam touching it and moving on. Everything outside was cold, but the room was warm, and the chair was warm from the fire, from the evening, from the particular warmth that lives in old wood that has been sat in for 100 years.